And we are recording. Hi, folks. Welcome to the YR World interview series. Today we are joined by Matthew Aldridge and Richard Pugh, and they are well known in the UK R community as, first off, the previous management of, current and previous management. That's a bit of a, we have to sort of clarify that, of Mango Solutions. They're also the founders of London R and the Earl Conference series. What we'll do here is actually sort of look at the earlier years of R, let's say 2005 to 2015, let's say. So that's a sort of like an interesting period, like that a lot of people will not know about, that before dplyr, before Tidyverse came along, and before there was a big explosion in MOOCs, online courses. So just a quick questions to get started. First off, tell us about your backgrounds, your sort of early career in R, how you found R, how you know each other as well, actually.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to start?
Yeah, so my background in R isn't anything to do with R. So I was the good-looking non-statistician of the two of us. And Rich and I met when we worked together at a company called Insightful. And I think over the years, what's been really interesting is fewer and fewer people know who Insightful were. And that speaks volumes about how the R world has moved on. So my background is sales, and I got a job with Rich selling a tool called S+, mainly to pharmaceutical clients. Rich, do you want to talk about your background?
So my background, I'm a trained statistician, and apparently the lesser attractive of the management team of Mango, apparently. Yeah, so my background is, obviously I was a statistician, and when I became a statistician and got a job in industry back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that meant SAS, basically, right? So I was a SAS programmer / statistical modeler, and I guess I at the time I described myself as a really odd statistician, in that, you know, if people gave me some analysis to do, I ended up writing all the code that automated my analysis. So I basically boiled my job down to like hitting F8 with different parameters and so on. So, and it didn't seem to be a lot of, you know, once I'd done that, there didn't seem to be a next challenge. So I sort of automated myself at a couple of stats roles early on. And I wanted to do something different. So I joined this company, Insightful, who was, you know, the developers of S+. And I went for the job, and it was a bit, I'm looking back, right? In the interview, they said to me, "Have you used S+ before?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've used it before. It's great." Never seen it. And so it was one of those things where, you know, I just kind of went along just for a chat, really, and ended up really, the idea of consulting across lots of industries was really appealing. So I ended up getting a job at Insightful as a pre-sales consultant. And they said, "Well, you know, get your feet under the desk, and in 2 weeks' time, we'll put you on a training course." And I was like, "Great, that sounds good." What they didn't tell me is I was teaching the training course. So I did like 2 weeks of cramming like crazy, and then taught a training course, and then went from there, really. And the S+ stuff was great, you know. So okay, so I'm bloody old, but I mean, for the younger members of your, you know, people listening to this, you know, where does R start? Well, R can track back to obviously 1976, right? So people like Doug Bates, you know, needing to do something with stats research, so they created a language called S. That was back in Bell Labs kind of time. And Insightful essentially leased S as the language, and then you know, released it as a piece of software called S+. So really the S language, if you like, S+ was the precursor to R, right? And as soon as R became popular, you know, that really kind of S+ kind of went away at that point, but same sort of language. But yeah, so I'm absolutely, you know, spent an awful lot of time, built my career around S and then R through the kind of early 2000s, and then through to Mango time, right?
Good stuff. So just actually in the early 2000s, what would be sort of the features of the statistical computing landscape? So SAS was around at the time, probably SPSS, and like, so those were the key sort of features. But what, like, you know, and also who used it? Was it banking and pharmaceutical industry? What was this sort of statistical computing landscape like at the time?
Yeah, it was very old fashioned. And so you've mentioned SAS and SPSS, you got to throw Excel in there as well. And then quite a lot of, niche tools as well. But I think the key that we found was people weren't really using a lot of the power of any of these tools. And certainly when I joined Insightful, it was fascinating watching Rich doing demos to people because, you've got a SaaS user. This is quicker, it's cheaper, it's better. All these things, and yet people still wouldn't necessarily come off it because of the legacy impact. And it took me a long time to understand that legacy lag was huge, and indeed we still got it today, where people are scared of actually updating tool sets and code bases from 20, 30. I mean, we see some horror stories out there where I can't afford to touch it. Well, you can't afford not to touch it at the same time. So yeah, it was kind of it was a really messy environment, and there was a massive distinction between tools for statistics and other tools. And I think one of the things we saw was a real merging in how a lot of the tools are used.
I think the other thing that really I found really early in the early days really was that the role of stats and the role of data science and modeling, whatever you want to call it, right? The role of using mathematical modeling to drive some outcome, right? That's changed so much over the last 20 years. And in the early 2000s, still analytics and stats was in most industries more of a reactive kind of back office function, right? If you look at the pharmaceutical industry at the time, if you look at back end finance, insurance, these were industries predominantly using frequentist GLM based kind of methodologies, right? In a really kind of reactive capacity. So, it was like the audit function, right, was the stats team. So that meant that, we had to use almost the same methodologies over and over again on the same problems every day and so on, to a point where, one of my earliest stats jobs was I had some data, and it was really clear the methodology that should work was a particular methodology, right? So, I think it was more of a time series problem than anything else. And so, yeah, I went away, thought about the methodology I would use, fit the data, built the models. And I remember communicating this, I went to a meeting and I presented to a load of the business users who were scientists at the time. And I presented my findings and said, so, in conclusion, we should definitely go ahead with this, or whatever the conclusion was. And people looked at me like completely dumbstruck and didn't understand. And I said to my boss after, I said, I've obviously messed that up. So what did I do wrong? And he said, well, they're just used to seeing the output from a linear regression. So just stick a line through it and tell them a p-value and they'll be happy. So if I'd literally gone into that session with like a slide that just said like 0.003 in it and gone, any questions, they would have been happy. So the role of stats was weird, right? And so this whole thing about, using SAS and so on was, well, kind of at the time, it didn't massively matter, right? Because think about it, today in the data science world, it's far more proactive, more decision-making, closer to the coalface, broader range of challenges. And whereas in the old days, your code was something you wrote for yourself, right? Versus these days where your code is like a primary output of what you do, right? Because you need to make it repeatable. In the old days, your code could be rubbish. I mean, SAS code, my SAS code, I wrote for me, right? So my variable names were like temp1, temp2, temp3, no coding standards, no, as long as I got the graph out at the end or the number out, who cares really? No one looked at it, right? So I think that a lot of the role of technology in the stats landscape has really been driven by the change in remit and role of stats and analytics and data science. And I think that's where, for me, you could talk about R being, what's the power of R, right? You can talk about it being like graphics or modeling or research, whatever it is. For me, R was just like the absolute brilliant, like right time piece of software, right time, right place, right structure. And I think that's kind of where it really took off for me.
Okay, so just actually, where did, for, let's say, we'll sort of scope this to the UK. When did R really take off, or what was the sort of the trajectory of R in the UK, let's say? London R started in 2009, but that's a sort of like a waymark on the way, but surely it was around before that.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we set Mango up was that the two of us saw that R was going to really address some issues and attack that S plus market at the same time. So we founded Mango in 2002. R was already around and was gaining a lot of pace, but it was about 2 or 3 years before we did a commercial project using R. And at the time, that was a hedge fund. And hilariously, as we look back, their budget was tiny. And so they had the opportunity to either spend the money on licenses of S Plus or SAS or something similar, or they could actually use R and then use the budget to tailor it to what they were trying to do. And they were really, really brave. I mean, we sort of laid it all out for them. I mean, in those days, R's version changed rapidly. It was really, really fast paced, and every quarter there'd be something that meant that, well, that's broken that, or that's not quite going to work. But they were really, really keen, and actually they loved it. They became very competent R programmers themselves, and they lifted and they helped themselves a lot. So about 2004, 2005 is when you really start seeing commercial organizations, pick that up in Europe and actually run with it.
Yeah. I think you're right, Matt. I think the project for me, because there was the hedge fund one, but there was also there was a pharmaceutical company in the UK who wanted to build a clinical trial simulation engine, right? So it was all about, instead of running that clinical trial, kind of simulate the trial, and therefore you end up in this situation where it's like an embarrassingly parallel simulation problem, right? So what they wanted to do is they had like a 400 blade Linux cluster or something they wanted to use. And what they realized is if they did this in SAS, which was the predominant technology for them, then they'd have to license SAS on 400 nodes, which you don't want to do, right? So I think the reason that we ended up really gravitating to R was because 400 times 3 is still free, right? So I think that was another really good example. And for me, that was the sort of industries, right? Because you look at the industries who are quite defensive and risk averse, people like the pharmaceutical industry. And you kind of always thought when those people started taking those projects, taking R on seriously and using it, then that was probably when the industry kind of was really mature. So yeah, I would say 2005, 2006 was the time where people were starting to really use R, I think, in commercial. But at that point, it was in pockets. And I don't know if you remember that sort of era, but it was always, that weird R person in that department who uses it, and therefore will bang on about it in every meeting that you came to. And so it became about, and the community stuff you talk about, a lot of that was about connecting some of those individuals in those organizations who started to be, to kind of promote R and kind of, I remember the early conversations in London were all about, well, I'm the only person in my department using it. How do I convince others to? What was a big conversation back in the early days, right?
I think that was a key factor, actually, was how brave some of the individuals were, and looking at the different cultures within organizations of, are you allowed to tell people this is what you're doing, or do you hide it away completely? And there was a full range of options, but very often these people were, exceptionally lonely and exceptionally dedicated as well. And that was where the community really developed fast, because you had real expertise in these one or two people in an organization. And the expertise is then what drove some of that adoption at the same time, because they were so good at what they were doing. And that then snowballed as R continued to develop.
Yeah. And it almost made sense for like universities to teach on R at that time, right? So you then started to have this. I remember really early on, I taught a training course, in a big company, and maybe 20 people on this training course. It was a bit packed, and we, the boss was in the room at the back, and this was like probably late 2000s, let's say, and we started talking about R, and like pretty much everyone in the room had already heard of R and already used R in university, right? And so the boss kind of stood up and went, why are you all using SAS then? And they was like, well, because you told us to, but we already knew R. and you brought us in with one skill set and then taught us this other, but then said, no, you must use sets. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where it started to really snowball is around the late 2000s, I would say. And London R was obviously kind of like, an upshot of that. But I think there were probably versions of London R much earlier than 2009, I would say. But, it was like, let's go to the pub and chat about R with like 2 or 3 people you knew from different companies, right?
Yeah, and also that was in-house, wasn't it? Max at Pfizer was banging the drum there, and there's some definite. But it was very much people, allowing themselves to potentially get their head shot off by saying, here's something I've done really quickly and really and effectively, and it really suited, as Rich said earlier, that whole rush to actually use stats in a much more productive and intuitive way was really, really helped by R, because you didn't have to worry about, licensing a certain package to add on. You didn't have to worry about how many users you got. And that allowed these things to flow through the organizations.
Good stuff. So just actually a couple of key points there is like let's say 2005 to 2010. This is when universities started to use R in, let's say, college courses and stuff like that. And this is when the end of that period would be the dawn of the R user groups in 2009 and so on. So this is a sort of a key period. What was R like technologically at the time? This was still before dplyr and ggplot and stuff like that. So this is the real golden age of base R, if you will.
It was, I tell you what, Kev, it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I mean, the tidyverse ruined R, right? I mean, let's just have that on camera, right? And what I mean by that is, so I was really, really lucky, right? I mean, I was taught R and S essentially before that and so on by people like David Smith and John James. So I look back and go, bloody hell, I had some really good people around me at the time. So I was really, really lucky. And I guess for me, you end up, especially when you do a lot of training and a lot of consulting in R in the early days, you end up having to wrestle with some of the kind of like, I suppose, poor design left over from the S era. Because you've got to remember that, R came from S in some respects, and therefore there were design decisions at the time, particularly in the early days, that were really about how you take the S stuff and do it slightly differently. But actually, in hindsight, there's probably stuff you probably would have gone further and made it more different in those days. So yeah, look, I look back and it's very nostalgic for me, but I love things like, if you look at my code, right, if there isn't an apply call per line of code, then I've obviously had a bad day, right? And I used to love the eccentricities of like working with like lists and lapply and, understanding, the different various uses of do.call and how you could use that to, do.call R bind stuff and so on. So I love that. And actually I still code in R a lot, but I code for myself these days, really. I don't code in customer projects. And I look now at, how nice the syntax is and so on. But yeah, I really miss the old days. So I guess what were the so the language was really, if you wanted to do stuff, then you really need to understand the apply functions and the structures really quite deeply, you'd end up with lines of codes that obviously had square brackets and curly brackets and commas, and but you had to know all that and revel in it. And then beyond that, you had things like, I remember we started looking at parallelization. So as packages like Snow came out, which was all around, how do you actually split that process onto? Like when I built that clinical trial simulation, engine for the pharma company, I had to hand crank all of that, right? I had to work out how to actually physically split the task, how to actually call head nodes on grid clusters, there was no help at the time, right? So I think you just used R a slightly lower level, if you like. And then you ended up, this was before the days of like really R Studio and Shiny and stuff like that. So I guess you just had to do, a lot more. But yeah, no, I loved coding like that, and I'm still an old school R programmer when it comes to it, right? That's why I promise I will never code in a customer project again, because the younger kind of generation of brilliant R programmers coming through, like the people in Mango today. Like, I am granddad in the corner these days. So, and I understand that. And I'm quite happy in that role, actually.
We used to have to qualify really, really hard about data size and what you were intending to do with it. And, it's fascinating now looking at the range of options of creating parallel processes, because in those days, actually, it was a real, we don't want to go down this road and then find that actually because it was single threaded, can't cope with this, and all those promises I've made, actually can't come true. And we used to, it's fascinating looking back, but, I can remember arguing with an actuary about how much, actuarial data they needed to get into a query for it to be statistically significant. Now, bearing in mind, I'm not a statistician. I was, out of my depth somewhat, but you really needed to persuade them to actually accept that, less might be more in those situations, and to approach that project in a totally different way. Whereas today, with the sort of the Hadoop environment moving out of Hadoop, we've kind of reached a situation where throw it all in and then see what happens, which of course brings its own problems. But really, really interesting. If it was a Microsoft shop, then you sort of run away a little bit from things like that, because it just didn't have that technology base. So really interesting times, because you really had to be on the front foot with it, and of course the development path meant that there was always an improvement coming. In the next version, wait for the next version, it's going to be great, and very often it was as well. But customers didn't really like that when we talked about it.
A quick question. So it's like about London R. Tell us about the genesis of London R. So it was quite an unusual move at the time, because this was the era before meetup.com. And in fact, you're probably one of the first R user groups in existence. You're definitely the first one I attended, so.
Yeah. No,
that means we're the first.
Exactly, yeah. It was, I suppose what was happening at the time is that, like I said, you ended up at that time where there was lots of like individuals. There'd be one person in a department who was crazy about R and so on. And those people didn't really have places to talk to, but they would talk to Matt and I, right? So this is, I think the kind of use R conferences were quite established back then, right? So you'd kind of meet up and at those points, but there was not really, but I think at the time I used to go to the use R conferences, and it was largely academic, I think, part of it. So I think there was a real commercial audience, people trying to push the boat out a bit in the commercial world. They didn't really have anyone to talk to, and so they used to talk to Matt and I. So we'd end up in a situation where we'd go to use R, and we'd be the oddballs in the corner, because we're someone from a bank and someone from a pharma company and so on, and then we sort of, when we started talking about what we could do better, I think we ended up going to the pub a few times, just a few people we knew essentially back in the day. And I haven't a clue who that would have been, Matt, but I mean, Pat Burns and Mike Smith, Marcus Guess, but those kind of people, right?
Yeah.
And I think we just kind of said, well, let's make this a bit bigger. And so we started it, and we're British, right? So we started it in a pub. What was the first pub? Was it the one by
Shooting Star, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was it was Liverpool Street.
That's the one.
It's not there anymore, I don't think.
No, but the first London Eye, there must have been, if there were like 10 people, I'd be surprised. I mean, it was tiny, right?
I think we got to about 20, and I can remember it was David Jessup, Pat, and Rory Winston spoke, and they were absolutely brilliant, because they all just said, come on, let's just do it and see what happens. And it was really exciting, because and it was that whole culture of the talks were great, but actually it's the talk afterwards over a pint that was really beneficial, and I think was really useful in those days, because one of the things that people like SAS would say about R was, it's too complicated and there's no community. It's free and open. You don't know who these people are, but very, very quickly that community grew, and to this day has just been an amazing part of the development of the tool. It's really humbling to see.
Oh, good stuff. So, just actually, like, how has the R community developed in London since? I know that like London R has fostered it a lot, particularly with the workshops that they would do before the main conference, like, and it's sort of they've been great events. Just like, what would your how would you sort of interpretation or your perspective of how it's grown over the last 10 years?
So in the early days, it was almost solidly finance with a little bit of pharma attendees. And, you know, every now and then you would just, you know, again, as a non-statistician, I'd sit at the front chairing a session and be totally bewildered by a presentation, so much Greek on a slide. And of course, if no one asks a question, then it's my job to sort of step in. And so that was really fascinating. And we had, you know, some really complex talks in those days. And then as the R world grew, then the tone and the attendee sort of profile changed with it. And so we very rarely had marketing people along in the early days, for instance. And then it was almost like a switch in the marketing world where SPSS got turned off, R got turned on, and you see this drift. And that was really great, because then you saw that, you know, that cross-fertilization between industries was a really important part of why. And, you know, some of our closest contacts in pharmaceutical research were amazed by what, you know, other industries were allowed to do, you know, and how easy it was to actually, you know, use your favorite tool. So yeah, over time we've seen that real change. And of course, you know, today Laura doesn't have to fight to get people to talk quite so much as we used to in those days. So there was it wasn't quite blackmail, but there was a fair amount of begging that went on in those days.
I think the growth of, you know, R in London, for example, around London R and so on. I see it in terms of like the way the data science movement has kind of come along and the growth, right? Because, you know, I think that, you know, you used to talk to people in industries that were analytically mature, right? So industries where modeling has been used for years, and, you know, pharmaceutical, banking, you know, kind of insurance, retail, and so on. And I think these days, I just think the range of organizations looking to use data to, you know, to kind of add value is huge, right? You know, in the last couple of months, I've been working with, you know, a Premier League football team and a construction company, and you know, these are, you know, 20 years ago, you never imagined kind of working with these organizations on proper modeling kind of projects, right? So I think that growth has really kind of been, and that's where I think R has been perfectly of technology alongside that growth, and you can suddenly try stuff out, fail fast, and get the new techniques and so on. And I think that's where the world is really open to that. And of course now, you know, what London R is like, it's kind of, it's a great environment, right? There's a few hundred people in that downstairs pub thing, you know, Balls Brothers, right, with a decent pint at the back and good chats afterwards. You know, I think it's always been, I think, a really strong community in London, and it's been brilliant just to be a part of it, right? That's been great.
Just a quick question now regarding, we discussed London there, but Mango Solutions actually sort of well known, or sort of in the southwest of the UK, not actually in London. Close enough, but like there's probably its own little world over there. What's that like over there?
Yeah, there's some stuff around here. It's kind of, so I'm part of the data science section at the RSS, right? And it's interesting because the RSS is obviously based in London, and so you end up with like this kind of very London-centric view of like the UK and the RSS and so on. So, you know, very often we end up getting involved in the other stuff, in the other areas. So, you know, we've sponsored our meetups in places like Manchester and Oxford, and, you know, and so on and so forth. In the West Country, there is an R meetup in Bristol, run by, I think it's still run by Nick Cranes, you know, which is really good. We run data science, Bristol Data Science, which is like a slightly broader environment. But yeah, it's kind of hard to gather people together, right? So, you know, an audience in the West Country for a data science meetup might be 40, 50 people. So still a good crowd. Slightly harder to get people to talk because there's just less of a pool there. So yeah, London's a lot easier from that perspective. But we've also run meetups in like we run New Jersey R for a while, and we still run like Basel R, and we get involved in like Geneva and Zurich and stuff like that. So we which is mostly because the clients, a lot of our clients were over there essentially. So but yeah, so there's definitely life outside London, Kevin. But yeah, it's London R is probably, I suppose, the UK's, I don't know, kind of center, I guess, perhaps, but for all stuff.
Just actually out of curiosity, my first London R event was just immediately after a Royal Statistical Society event. It was about a 10-minute walk from Earl Street to Middlesex Street, or 10 or 15-minute walk. But I never really sensed that there was a connection between the two at all. Like I never really got any, there was one R event that the Royal Statistical Society ran, but that was it for pretty much 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so obviously the RSS is really founded on statistical kind of heritage, and you look at some of the kind of previous chairs, and it's like a who's who of stats, right? But I think that in modern times, the RSS is, if you go to the conference now, it says the Society for Statisticians and Data Scientists. So there is a broadening, and the DSS is part of that within the RSS. So there's not been really a direct link in the past, but I guess because ours heritage is stats research and the RSS is kind of like stats based, there's always been a kind of, I guess, some sort of crossover, and so I know that the RSS does some stuff around our training, and I think Colin's involved in the RSS a bit as well, and so on, right? So there's some links, I think, but no, they are really separate communities in that way.
Yeah. I think back in the day, the RSS was a lot more theoretical and not so interested in the softwares that were being used.
It was very trade.
Yeah, it was, and it was, as a non-statistician, going to RSS meetings was always, really fascinating in many respects, because it wasn't so much about how are you going to roll this out into the community. It was, I've done something clever, and which of course has its own value, and I think a large part of the last few years has been catching up and understanding how people are using stats, because you've got this much bigger crowd of people who are statistically aware these days.
Okay. Just a sort of quick question now. I think the formal kickoff of the R versus Python language wars was around 2013 or 2014. And this is sort of like the dawn of the data science era. But just like, what would your perspective be in that, in terms of the growth of data science when it became the trendy thing, and R's role in it, let's say, with comparison to Python?
Well, I think So I think the world does not need another R versus Python blog post. I'm pretty sure we've got sufficient numbers of those now, which is great. And I remember going through a period where all people wanted to talk to me about was, use R, use Python, what's best, and we've even had that, in our groups, we've tried to get people along. Like we had one of our Python guys host the R meetup once, and I was like, no, I want you to host it because you're passionate about Python. This guy was like really anti-R. I was like, this is perfect for you, and it was good actually. Look, I think that I've come from a background where I used to use SAS, so it was so it was so difficult to actually do anything exploratory or anything novel, or and I remember when I first one of the macros I wrote in SAS was for kind of this particular regression technique, and Mandel regression, I think it was. We get errors in X and Y, and it took me weeks to do it. Right, the code was ridiculous, and I remember when I started using S and then R, I decided to actually kind of recreate that, and it was like this beautiful tiny little thing. So look, I come from that heritage, and therefore for me, R is massively powerful and was there at the start of the data science movement. It was exactly what we needed. Python now is obviously kind of as strong as R. I mean, yeah, you can kind of talk about where they're slightly better and so on, but generally it's for me, as long as you're using R or Python or Julia as a technology, in fact any technology that just gives you the capability to experiment quickly, deploy quickly, try things out, then you're kind of okay. And if you look at our team, there are there's a massive crossover between people who use R heavily and use Python heavily. So you know, we've tried to build a team internally now that are, you know, kind of conversant with both technologies essentially. But you know, and I think so that's kind of all happening. But the reality of the situation is, you know, and you know, Kevin, you know, I love talking about R, and I love talking about technologies, and I love talking about the algorithms that are used and so on. But the reality of the situation right now, and I think this is where the data science movement is getting to, is, you know, the culture in an organization beats the question you're going to ask. The getting the right question nailed down is going to be better, you know, is going to give you more value than actually the way you think about the question. The way you're going to think about the question and abstract it is, you know, more relevant than, you know, than the algorithm or the tech you use. So it's kind of right at the bottom. And I think a lot of people now, and a lot of my role these days, is about helping organizations understand what's possible with data science and how to think about it, and finding the right idea to start with, and how you actually then can actually move that into an organization and change people's behaviors, right? Because I could build you the best model in the world, but if no one changes their behavior in that organization, it's like worth nothing, right? So all of that kind of stuff now is I guess, you know, a big part of the focus. And I think that's where things like ML ops, which is obviously stuff that we've been kind of involved in for, you know, or methodologies we've been doing for, you know, 15 years or so on. You know, that's kind of where all that I think is coming through now, is actually how do you actually make an impact? How do I get this out of my hands? So I'm quite happy to see the conversation moving away from R versus Python and more about, as a community, regardless of whether we use R or Python and so on, how do we make an impact before data science becomes like a phrase you could no longer use, right? Because it's the industry that failed, right? Which is like, you know, the big data world and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
actually, on that question, actually, I noticed that you're both the founders of the Earl Conference, and in 2021 that there's going to be big focus on the Earl Conference on data for good and sustainable development goals. Is that how you see the future of R, or that being a big part of R's future?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of data for good is something that Rich and I have always been really interested in. And if you go all the way back to 2002, who was using S+, who was using R? Actually, it was kind of banks, it was pharmaceutical industries, it was kind of old-fashioned stats. And so, you know, over the course of the last 20 years, you know, the barriers to entry have come down, that actually a lot of these organizations can employ their own analytics teams and do something with it. And it's really, really, you know, really fascinating to see, because as a free and open piece of software, obviously, you know, effort in it is rewarded multiple times. And so I think that there can be a real nice theme over the coming years around that.
yeah, I think the community, I think the population at large is ready for it, right? You know, if you think about, so obviously kind of the pandemic's a horrible thing, and I feel like I've sat in this chair for a year, and you know, and London R, you know, I've been to the virtual London R's, but you can't then have a pint with people afterwards. You know, you miss a lot, right? And but I think one of the interesting things I found with COVID was, you know, we're on the, you know, and a lot of our guys are currently in the JBC doing a lot of the kind of COVID analysis stuff, right? And you look at like the daily, you know, the daily presentations by the government, and so, you know, all of a sudden the general population every day is seeing things like fairly complex charts, right? And hearing summary stats like the R number, which is a concept, right? And I think even like Nicola Sturgeon, I think a couple of weeks ago, even used the phrase data-driven strategy, which I thought was amazing. So I guess we're playing it out now in the public. We're playing out this idea that, you know, data turned into wisdom, turned into action, right? We follow the data and all that kind of stuff. That's been played out just in front of the public. So I think that this pandemic, if you know, if there's any good that's come of it in any way, I think it's done a lot to raise the general data literacy levels of the population. And so I think that you know, there's a growing, and this has obviously been around for you know, a long time, and you know, people like you know, people like DataKind and so on have been around for a while and so on. But I think now is a really good time to say, well, you know, actually, you know, algorithms and so on to make, you know, a rich banker even richer than he or she was last year is a use of data, right? But actually, these can solve some of the fundamental problems in our society, right? And whether that's climate or social progress, or whether that's looking after just the most vulnerable people in our society, I think data and analytics can have a major role in that. And I just think that with the increase in literacy, I just think that the population is ready for that conversation, right? So I think it's a great time, and I think it's I think it's something that Matt and I have been passionate about for a long time, and it's trying to find the mechanisms to do it. So Earl is obviously a great event, and I really enjoy that conference and the community around that. And I think there's an example of a community that can really do some good. But I think there's other communities. I think the data science community in general has a massive role to play in sorting out the core problems in our society, right?
Good stuff. Just we'll leave it there because we're here a while. Just one sort of quick question for both of you: where's your R journey going to take you for the next 2 or 3 years? Matt, I'll go with you first there.
I think it's really that opportunity. So I think actually seeing the widespread use and dare I say the misuse of tools like R is really interesting, and I think we'll continue to see R being built into other tools and other packages. Currently it sort of feels to me as a bit of a tick box. Yes, we do stats. Is a link to R, but I think increasingly that flip from looking behind you at what's happened using BI to looking at predictive and prescriptive is kind of going to be the real pivot point, and I think R's got a massive role to play in that.
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm still coding in R for myself a lot. So if you ever want to see some really shocking uses of lapply, split, do crypto call, etc., then let me know, Kevin. But I guess beyond that, I mean my stats background together with the just my experiences of being just part of our community has taught me so much over the years. And I guess now a lot of what I'm doing is using that in order to understand, well, what's possible, what's hard, what's easy, and so on, and actually then turning that into advice for organizations, across lots of industries about, looking to use data a bit more proactively, and so I think that, yeah, I'm coding for myself, but I'm helping clients, I guess, from an advisory capacity more and more now. And I think that, data science as a phrase, maybe it'll die, maybe it'll go away, I don't know. But the idea of using advanced analytics to drive good decision making and so on, both in the commercial world and and elsewhere, I think is here to stay.
Good stuff. Actually, I have one more last question. Actually, what's your favorite not so well known R package?
Gosh,
Sudoku.
Okay.
Sudoku. What's my favorite?
That's a good one, actually. Yeah.
That's a really hard question, Kevin. That's a nightmare of a question.
Isn't it? I answered straight away.
Yeah.
Everyone has one, really.
It's kind of funny, right? So, I've worked in the commercial space, right, for 20 years, and so I've authored so many R packages that never see the light of day, right? I mean, never see the light of day, and so because these are own, kind of, I built them for a company, they own it, and so on, right? But I think one of my favorite projects that led to an R package is I worked with a great guy, Mike Smith, right, from Pfizer, on a simulation library many years ago, and this was obviously for Pfizer. But one of the things I really loved about it was part of the remit of the project was to not only kind of build something really kind of fundamental for Pfizer, but also really importantly open source it and actually have it out there in the community. And Mike's a great advocate for some of that. So yeah, the package is called MS Toolkit, and if you're in the pharma industry and want to do particularly kind of like simulations around dose response and stuff like that, it's a great package. But I love that. I guess that's my favorite package on the basis that it was great to see an advocate in a large organization like Pfizer, and this was early on as well, I think, right, kind of really promoting the role of open source and and actually kind of making that happen as well, which was that's probably my favorite story, I think.
Okay, good stuff. I think we'll leave it there because we've been at this a while, so we better sort of wrap it up. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to cut the recording now. Thanks very much. Bye bye.
Thanks, Kevin.
I'm just going to stop the recording now, so I'll do a